On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Andrew Woods, your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest, Evgeny Morozov. Evgeny Morozov is a contributing editor at The New Republic and the author of The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. From 2010 to 2012, he was a visiting scholar at Stanford University and a Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation. Previously, he was a fellow at Georgetown and a fellow at the Open Society Foundations. He's the author of a popular monthly column on Slate.com, and his writings have been featured in the New York Times, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the London Review Books, and many other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the risks of advanced technology in the heart of enemy territory, I think. Please welcome Evgeny Morozov.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I don't actually see any enemies here, so I assume we're all friends. It's, if you can believe it, it's actually the last talk of my book tour, so I can finally speak up my mind and be very... finally be very controversial. I was here 2 years ago for the first time to promote my first book, which was a book about the impact that the internet and social media were having on authoritarian states. And that's how I initially myself got into this field. I was born in Belarus. That's where I grew up. And those of you who don't know, Belarus still has a very complicated political situation since mid-90s. It's been a pretty ugly authoritarian regime, and the reason why I initially got excited about the power of social media and the power of the internet was because I thought that we can actually use blogs and social networks and a lot of these digital technologies to push for democracy in the country, right? And I was a very cheerful and utopian young fellow who actually thought we can use many of these tools to build a better world. And after 3 years of working in Belarus and traveling through the former Soviet Union, working for a couple of NGOs and foundations, I quickly got disillusioned, figuring out that the dictators themselves were very active users of many of these technologies. But I also figured out that that was not something that was understood in Washington, right? I figured out that a lot of our policymakers and a lot of our journalists and intellectuals still thought that the internet and blogs and social media were primarily responsible for liberating the world, for empowering dissidents, and they did not pay as much time to understanding how various software tools were actually used to monitor and spy on dissidents, how they were used to engage in propaganda, or engage in cyber attacks, and a lot of those tools were actually built right here in Silicon Valley, and we didn't really have any restrictions placed on those companies, while at the same time we were actually celebrating the role that the likes of Google and Facebook were playing in many of those countries, right? So part of my argument in my first book was that we in Washington, a lot of our policymakers are increasingly relying on Silicon Valley to actually promote democracy in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I was trying to investigate what are some of the costs of delegating something that we used to do out of the State Department to essentially Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Right, and then to sort of give away the ending of my first book, I wasn't particularly encouraged by the trends I saw, and I thought that there are many hidden costs and risks attached to having Facebook and Twitter and Google as the primary or even secondary promoters of democracy. So what I tried to do in my second book was to shift the attention a little bit, but still stick to the basic question. What happens once we delegate some of the responsibility for problem solving to Silicon Valley and to technology companies and the private sector in general? But the questions and the problems I focused on became very different. So instead of thinking about democratization and how we can promote freedom and democracy, I began asking questions about what happens once we delegate responsibility over fighting problems like climate change or problems like obesity, for example, to Silicon Valley. Right? What happens once we rely on technology, we rely on apps, we rely on technological fixes to address some of those problems, right? And so that was the basic research question with which I started the book. The reason why I think this question is worth asking now is because of two trends that have happened. Those trends are as follows. First of all, sensors with an S. I spent my first book talking a lot about censorship, and there was a lot of sensors with a C in that book. In the second book, there is a lot of sensors with an S, and it's little tiny sensing devices which can be embedded now in virtually anything. Right? You can embed sensors into cars, tables, walls, teapots, anything to generate new levels of interactivity, right? They can provide you with new information. You can make devices that were previously analog and dumb, so to say, you can make them smart, right? So you may have heard about smart devices and smart objects, right, which all incorporate sensors of some kind. So you may have heard that Apple recently patented smart shoes, right? So what do smart shoes do? They have a sensor built into them, and that sensor can figure out when the shoes are about to get worn out, and they will alert you, right, that that's happening. Has a sensor, gives you a prompt, results in a somewhat different decision. We have seen earlier this year the presentation of smart forks at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. What do? They have a sensor in them, and they can actually monitor how fast you're eating. So if they detect that you're eating too fast, they will start vibrating, telling you that you need to slow down. Again, the principle is the same. You take a previously dumb artifact, you build a sensor into it, it can detect what it is you're doing with it, and it can prompt you to behave differently. Right? The principle is the same in many of these devices. The same, I can go on forever. You have smart toothbrushes, right, which again have a sensor and can monitor how fast you're brushing your teeth, and they can actually share that data with your insurance company, with your dentist. Right? You have smart umbrellas that have a sensor built into them, and they have internet connectivity built into them that can check the weather, and actually have a little blue light that goes on if the weather says that it's going to rain. So the umbrella will actually warn you to take it with you when you leave the house. Right? Again, the principle in all of these examples I've specified is very similar. You take previously dumb objects, previously dumb devices, you build a sensor into them, and they allow, because they add extra information to the object, they can allow new types of behavior and solicit new types of behavior from the user, right? And that allows for new ways of problem solving. And I'll talk about that very shortly, but you can basically see what the principle is. The principle is that you can give the user more information and thus get the user to behave differently, right? So that's the principle. And the first trend is the proliferation of sensors that are getting cheaper and smaller. The second trend is easier, I think, to grasp, and it's the fact that because we're all present on social networks and because we're all carrying our smartphones with us, what has happened is that you can now basically take your entire social circle with you anywhere you go, right? So in Silicon Valley, people talk about it as the social, right? Now everything can be turned social, in part because pretty much every interaction that you have with each other or with social institutions can now be mediated, so to say, by a social circle. Right, so you can have apps. There is actually an app called Seesaw, which allows you to create instantaneous polls. If you are stuck with a difficult decision, you don't know what latte to buy, right? Or you don't know what dress to buy, or you don't know what politician to vote for, you can create an instantaneous poll with your smartphone, poll all of your friends immediately, solicit feedback, and make a decision. Right? The principle, again, is simple, that connectivity and the fact that your social circles are portable and they are immediately accessible allow to solicit new types of information, and they allow you to make new types of behavior. But you can also think about this principle even more expansively, because since your friends more or less follow with you everywhere you go with your phone, you can create games, right, where you actually participate in competition with other people. And that's also something that Silicon Valley has tapped into in the last few years. Those of you who live and work here may have noticed the rise of the so-called gamification, right? And it's this principle that you can actually turn virtually anything into a game by rewarding people with points, right, for doing things that they previously did because they, thought it was the right thing to do, or they did it because they, wanted to save the world, or they wanted to do something good for humanity. Now, you can bypass all of this inefficient moral and ethical incentives, and instead of relying on ethics, essentially start rewarding people with virtual currencies or some other types of currencies, in terms of attention for performing all sorts of acts. So you can start compensating people for, picking up litter from the street, because you all carry cell phones, and your cell phones can identify, because they also have sensors, when it is that you're reaching out to pick up some litter. You can easily, automatically build a compensation system that will reward you with points that you can then, compare with your friends. So this is the second trend, right? The fact that you can actually carry your friends with you, that allows for new types of peer pressure. And some of that peer pressure can be positive. It can be showing your friends how good you are and what are some of the things you do. And some of that pressure can be negative. It's kind of, shaming, showing your friends that you're not doing the good thing. So how do those two trends interact? For me, a very good anecdotal example of these two trends in action is a prototype design that I found built by engineers and designers in Britain and Germany. It's a product called BinCam, right? So what does BinCam do? BinCam is a smart trash can, right? So it's a trash can that stands in your kitchen, and of course, it has a sensor built into it, and in this case, the sensor is a smartphone, right? That's built into its upper lid, right? And just before I continue, it's a serious project, right? It's not an art project built by some art students. It's an actual project built by serious designers who are concerned with saving the planet and changing recycling habits, right? So it's a serious intervention. So we're talking about a smart trash bin. It has a smartphone built into its upper lid. And the purpose of this phone is to take a photo every time you open or close the lid. So the idea is that you can actually snap a picture of what it is you have just thrown away, right? Why would anyone want to do such a thing? Well, the idea is that after you snap that photo, it's being uploaded to a website called Mechanical Turk, which is run by Amazon, where freelancers are paid to do things that computers cannot do yet. So in this case, freelancers are being paid to analyze whether you're recycling things correctly or not. And if you're recycling things correctly, you're being awarded points, which, along with the photo, are uploaded to your Facebook page, where you're competing against other households, right? So the idea is that something as trivial as throwing away trash can be turned into a nice little game where new types of ethical behavior, right, or in this case, correct behavior, can be solicited from you as a citizen, right, bypassing essentially the language of morality and the language of ethics, right? Because now you can actually get people to do the right thing, in this case, recycle, without having any conceptual model of understanding what is right and wrong, because essentially they will be doing it because they are competing against other households, right? And this might seem like a very compressed and trivial example, but I think it very nicely illustrates the new types of possibility of problem solving that have suddenly become possible thanks to those two trends. Thanks to the fact that sensors can now be built in almost anything, and thanks to the fact that now almost anything can be made social. So essentially, my argument is that we have ended up with a new type of privately run infrastructure for problem solving, right? And this infrastructure is run by Silicon Valley, it's run by Google, it's run by Facebook, it's run by companies who own and run the smartphones and run the gadgets, and then it's also run by companies that run the platforms where we are socializing with each other. So now that we as a society have this infrastructure, the question for us becomes, how much do we want to use it? And if we are not going to use it, what are some of the reasons for not using it? Right? What are some of the reasons for refusing to rely on the smart trash bin? Right? Do we want to do it because we are just concerned about privacy? Which I think is a valid excuse, because technically, if you think about the privacy implications here, basically, in the past, FBI could not just go to you and ask what was in your trash can 3 weeks ago. I mean, they can, but they would never find out documentally what the answer was. Now, if the smart environments take over, they would be able to go to Facebook and just ask them for a picture of what was in your trash can 3 weeks ago, and they will get it. Right? So the fact that, it's the same principle with the smart toothbrush, right? It has all sorts of benefits. It can monitor data that will end up with your dentist and might improve your teeth eventually or save you from some extra trouble. But it also creates an environment in which a lot of this trivial data is suddenly accessible and it's suddenly collected. I can't possibly imagine why FBI would want to know how many teeth you have or what was in your mouth 3 weeks ago, but this data, thanks to smart devices, is now recorded, analyzed, and stored somewhere, right? So it becomes accessible. So the privacy layer is important to consider, but I would argue that it's not the only reason why we should worry about the proliferation of smart objects on the one hand, and then these new types of social incentives like gamification. Another reason to worry, and I think it's much more important, is that solving problems in this manner by essentially having citizens readjust their own behavior, whether it comes to recycling or whether it comes to climate change, is a very particular way of doing politics, and it's only one way to pursue reforms, and there are many others. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way. So let me unpack what exactly I mean by this. So some of you may know Google Now, right? The app that Google has built last year. Those of you who don't know it, it seems like a very useful app. So what Google Now does is that it analyzes everything that you do across all of the Google services. So it analyzes what you do on your Gmail. It analyzes what you do on your Google Calendar. It analyzes what you do on YouTube. It analyzes what you search for. And then it tries to predict what you might be doing in the near future. Next day, next hour, next week. And then it tries to do some of those things for you, right? So the principle is that you can actually predict what you'll be doing next and have Google do it for you as long as it's something trivial and would otherwise cause you some trouble. So to give you an example, which Google likes to give all the time, is that imagine you have a flight reservation in your inbox, and Google knows that you'll be catching a flight later today. So it will automatically, thanks to Google Now, check you into your flight. It will automatically check the weather at your destination. And it will tell you that it might rain, so you might need to get an umbrella. It will never get wet in this new digital future. And it will also check the traffic conditions on the way to the airport, and it will tell you that there is traffic, so you might need to leave sooner. Right? So it's trying to make your life easier by essentially analyzing what it is you'll be doing, and it's trying to preempt it and provide you with information that will simplify your life, or it will just do some of the things like checking in itself. All of that sounds very good, but now it also does an additional thing as well. It also analyzes, thinks it's a smartphone app, and your smartphone has a sensor, an accelerometer in it, which knows when it is that you're walking and when it is that you're not walking. It actually tracks how many miles you walk every month, right? And at the end of each month, without you ever asking for it, it shows you how many miles you've walked in the last months, and it shows you whether this month you've walked more or whether this month you walked less than the previous months. Right? It shows you the percentage change. And here, those of you familiar with behavioral economics or the work of Cass Sunstein will recognize that what Google is essentially doing is trying to create a nudge. Right? It's trying to do something that will hopefully result in a different behavior from you. Right? It's trying to show you information which will hopefully modify your behavior, and in this case, will make you walk more, it will make you exercise more, or you can think of many other interventions which become possible, again, thanks to the fact that Google runs this new information-based infrastructure for problem solving. With Google Glass, as we'll all soon be wearing, as you probably already well aware, you'll be able to monitor even more things, and you'll be able to create even more nudges, again, in part because so much of our activities will be monitored for good purposes, and it will be easy to just display reminders and tell us that we are eating too much fat, we're not eating enough vegetables. All of that feedback can be generated in real time based on our own behavior. So in this sense, Google Now is an early precursor of the kind of ubiquitous nudging that suddenly becomes available as we're all interconnected to this new problem-solving infrastructure. And you might think that what could possibly be wrong with telling you that you need to walk more, right? Or that you need to eat more vegetables. And I think that as a bonus, as an additional feature to other types of problem solving, this is a very good intervention. However, I'm not sure that given the intellectual climate and the broader socioeconomic background to the introduction of many of these initiatives, I'm not sure that this will be a bonus. And I actually think that it will be a replacement of many of the existing efforts to solve problems like obesity or climate change. Essentially, what's happening is that we are replacing more ambitious ways to tackle these political issues. And what are some of those ways? It's passing new laws, regulating industries, building infrastructure. I mean, there are all sorts of things which do not require building an app, which tackle a problem at a much higher level, and actually tries not just to put some temporary patch on the problem and pretend that it doesn't exist, but getting citizens to behave differently, but actually goes and tries to address the root causes of the problem, right? And it could be the fact that, in the case of obesity, that the food industry is poorly regulated. It could be that the way it advertises to kids is poorly regulated. Or it could be, there are all sorts of other factors that might need to be considered, which I'm afraid is not considered at all. In part because what we are doing is essentially asking the citizen to adjust their own behavior within the constraints of the system, which itself is treated as completely fixed and unchangeable, right? So you're being told that you need to move more, but we're not necessarily asking questions about whether there is anywhere to move, actually, right? And that's the fundamental question that you cannot solve with an app, right? Because apps are very good at generating behavioral change in citizens and users, but my fear is that very soon we'll forget that there are other ways to tackle problems, right? And there are other more ambitious ways in which we can actually go and do something about the problematic situation we're in. And I think if you think about a problem like obesity, you can see, take someone like Michelle Obama. So Michelle Obama started a very ambitious campaign when Barack Obama got elected to do something about obesity, right? And her first move, if you look at the rhetoric in 2008, 2009, was that we need to do something about food companies, right? We need to do something about the food industry, and she was very ambitious. 5 years later, as you follow the news, you'll see what that effort has come to. It has become all about planting vegetables in your own garden and moving more, right? And moving more is an interesting intervention, but moving more is not necessarily as ambitious as regulating the food industry. And it's something that doesn't require any fights in Washington, and it doesn't require any political intervention that is actually difficult and requires structural reforms. So part of my argument, and I know it's taking a long time to deliver this point, is that as we have seen the emergence of these new problem-solving infrastructures, we're also facing governments who are, for many reasons, very interested in exploring this infrastructure. And some of those reasons have to do that with the fact that we are living through the times of austerity where governments just don't have money for solving many of those problems. We're also living through the times where governments have tried like Michelle Obama, they have tried many of these fixes, more ambitious fixes, whether it's laws or regulations, and they haven't worked. They're also facing industries that have found ways to organize and mobilize very well, and they're opposing any efforts at regulation. So this is the bad news. And the good news is that everyone loves building apps, everyone loves innovation, and everyone wants to be seen as being friendly to Silicon Valley. So you have a lot of policymakers who are very excited about exploring these new tools, who are very excited about exploring apps, who are very excited about these new technologies for reasons that I've just outlined. They either run out of other options, they run out of money, or they just want to be seen as someone on the cutting edge. And as far as actual problem-solving efforts are concerned, this is not good news at all. And this is where I myself am very concerned about where we are headed, because I don't believe that, as much as I think that nudging are a good idea, I don't think that they can tackle complex problems, because you cannot tackle these complex problems by forcing citizens, asking citizens to change their behavior. You need to change how institutions and industries work. And unfortunately, we don't have apps for that. It requires much more difficult types of interventions. So, what I do in my book is basically try to analyze the rise of what I call solutionism, right? And what I've just described is I think, fits under the solutionist umbrella. But solutionism, to me, has many other components and many other sides. It also describes many efforts to, again, profit from this new infrastructure for problem solving without necessarily asking any deep questions about what got us into this mess in the first place and to what extent some of the solutions may actually make the situation worse. So let me give you an example that might help or might not help. So part of what I'm saying, actually, before I give you the example, is the simple idea that having good intentions is not enough, right? And I think it's a message that is not very often heard in Silicon Valley, where any activity in something that has a social political dimension is automatically considered good, right? You think as long as some private company expresses a wish to solve a problem like obesity or a problem like climate change, it must be by default a good idea. And you can make the same you can make the same statement about NGOs. You can make the same statement about anyone who uses new fancy technology to address many of these problems. And part of what I discovered, even in my first book, was that having good intentions is not enough. I know from my own work in the former Soviet Union that a lot of the work we did in promoting democracy with Western funding in countries like Belarus actually made things much worse for democracy, and we can talk about it later on. So I approached this from the perspective of someone who thinks that good intentions are hardly enough, and very often good intentions backfire. So it's a very long prelude to, I guess, the final anecdote I want to share with you. And it's an anecdote about fact-checking, right? So fact-checking, as you have noticed during the last election campaign, right, is something that has really taken off in America, right? Everyone wants to fact-check everyone, including the fact-checkers, and then including the people who fact-check the fact-checkers, right? And it's become the new fetish in the country. And part of that has to do with the fact that so much information is being stored, right? You can pretty much go and easily transcribe any statement made by politicians. You can easily store it in a database. You can easily bring it up. I mean, a show like The Daily Show would be impossible 20 years ago because, you didn't have TV, or you didn't have all sorts of other tools, right? So you would not be able to pull so many quotes in 20 minutes. So what's happening now is that, as you probably well know, you have a couple of media organizations, media nonprofits like PolitiFact, and there are a few others, which try to fact-check statements made by politicians or intellectuals, anyone else, and try to rank them on a scale from 1 to 5, or true to false, with a lot of points in between. Partially true, partially false, neutral. We've seen all of this. So you have a couple of very interesting technological projects built by people who I'm sure have very good ideas, and noble ideas. I described one of them in the book, a project called Truth Goggles, right? And what it does is something very interesting. So since you have these media organizations doing the fact-checking, right, they also run databases that contain claims and facts that have been fact-checked. Right, so they have databases with tens of thousands of claims about, whether the economy is growing at 5 or 10%. That claim has been fact-checked. Whether America is spending more money in Afghanistan this year than last year, the claim has been fact-checked. So they run all those databases, right? And those databases are accessible to anyone else. So you can actually build an app that will send a request to the database, and then you can actually fact-check any information using that database as your source of fact-check claims, right? Makes sense so far. So you have someone running a database, you rely on the database, you build an app, then you could do something with that app. So this project, Truth Goggles, does the following. So it's a little extension that you install in your browser, right? And basically, whenever you read an article, say in the New York Times, right? Whenever that extension spots a claim that has been identified as false or partially false, it will highlight that claim in red, right? As to alert you as a reader that something is fishy in this claim and something is fishy in this article. And by extension, claims that are not highlighted in red are considered to be kosher, right? They're okay. You don't really have to exercise your critical thinking about something that someone in Washington said because the fact-checking has been done. In theory, again, this sounds like a very good setup, and you might believe that this will greatly improve the climate for political discussion in America. However, Then, of course, you need to start asking the question of how do those media organizations actually fact-check those claims, right? Where does the original data come from? Because it's great to build an app using someone else's database, but if you don't ask questions about how do claims get into the database, how do you know that you're actually improving the public debate and not just amplifying some of the trends that may not be that nice? So in the book, I point to a couple of claims that PolitiFact has fact-checked. And those are claims about, say, drone warfare, or about the question of whether American government can use drones to target its own citizens, right, if they are suspected of terrorist activities. Right? So how does an organization that does media fact-checking verify the truth of such claims? So they ring up 3 experts in Washington, right, sitting in 3 different think tanks. Brookings Institution, Council on Foreign Relations, and, Carnegie Endowment. And of course, depending on what those experts say, the claim that might otherwise seem normal might seem partially false or partially true, right? And on issues like drone warfare, where there is, or cyber warfare for that matter, where there is a heavy presence in this debate of various defense companies and think tanks, and there is also in many Washington think tanks, they're not exactly always objective reflectors of reality, right? I mean, very often they are tied to ideologists in the White House, and it's not necessarily that they are sources of wisdom or sources of truth. So if you go and fact check the claim about drone warfare made by someone like, to pick some fringe figure like Noam Chomsky, if you go and ask a bunch of experts at the Brookings Institution and Council on Foreign Relations about Noam Chomsky's opinion about drone warfare, it will probably label it as partially false. Now, whether it's partially false or not is a question mostly of ideology and not of facts. And if we start making claims made by people with extreme positions, like Chomsky, and his position might look extreme, in part because he just falls so outside from the mainstream discourse in Washington, we might actually end up with people being even less critical of the current ideological discourse in Washington and not asking questions about how power operates and how power affects discourse and how power affects what's being said and what's being written in think tanks than we currently have, right? And then the question becomes, do we actually want to end up in a world where people are suspending judgment in what they read because they have delegated some of the judgment to an extension in their browser, which itself has delegated its judgment to a database compiled by a media think tank, which itself relies on the think tanks, 3 think tank experts who might be on the payroll of defense industry. Right? And again, this might be like a very extreme example, but nowhere in the discussions of that fact-checking extension I've seen any concerns about how it might be affecting, for better or worse, the existing climate in America, right? Political climate for political speech and thinking. And here you see one of those most pathological features of solutionism, where you embark on a quest to save the world and solve all of the world's problems without actually spending too much time thinking about what those problems are, how they have emerged, and understanding what some of those layers are. Right? You just think that you have a great app. You know what the great app can do. It can fact check, or it can use a sensor, or it can build a gamification scheme into everything. And you don't actually ask all the questions you need to ask if you're really interested in solving the problem. So I don't think you can fix American politics by building the world's greatest app before ever asking what's actually wrong with American politics, right? And again, it might seem like a very trivial statement to make, but I think this is very often missing. And that's why we end up with a lot of supposedly great apps to fix education, or to fix healthcare, or to fix climate change, or to fix obesity, that do not actually pose very deep questions that we need to pose if we actually want to tackle these problems in the long term, and not just to patch them with a very ineffective patch in the short term. So I think I see like you almost like drowning in those questions. So I think I'll probably wrap up here, and I'll be more than happy to take your questions. And my basic point here is that while it's important to be solving problems, very often our solutions create even more problems than they solve. And we need to be very critical about how the problems themselves become problems before necessarily embarking on the kind of solutions that we want to promote. Very often, technological solutions work, but very often they wouldn't. And we need to find a framework in which we can actually start comparing technological fixes to social fixes, but we should also find a framework to be comparing technological fixes with each other, right? And very often they rely on very different logic, and you can't just say that just because a fix or a solution is technological, then it should be dismissed. I mean, that's not the case, and I would argue that a solution that relies on sensors has a very different dynamic than a solution that relies on gamification, right? There are all sorts of political, moral, and ethical implications built into both, and we need to find a way in which to distinguish between them. Whether those are concerns about privacy, whether those are concerns about morality, we need to find a new calculus for evaluating them. We cannot just say that they should be banned outright because they rely on technology or because they rely on society. So I think I'll stop here and be more than happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for those remarks. I'm trying to group some of these questions into categories, so let me start with a question of my own that I think gets at some of the questions that were raised. Use the moderator's prerogative to ask this question. I think, so there are a number of different arguments obviously bundled together in some of your claims. So let me try to pose a question that's disconnected from technology in a way. So you know, if you're opposed to an app that collects data about how people behave and then suggests a healthier way to live, are you opposed to the exact same scenario where no technology is involved? So which is just nudging generally. So Bob Cialdini, one of the founders of behavioral economics or social psychology that led to a lot of the behavioral economics insights, did these studies where he gave people information about the energy use of their neighbors. And it turns out that after telling people, you're using too much energy, you should use less, that had very little effect. But telling them that they were using more than their neighbors got them kind of competitive, gamified the energy use, and energy went down. Isn't that an unallied good?
I wouldn't say it's an allied good. I mean, because to understand whether it's an allied good, you have to understand what other options are on the table, and you have to understand how that particular solution affects the citizens and whether it forces them to think more and develop more complex narratives about climate change. And it could be that it doesn't. So again, the fact that it relies on technology to me doesn't make any difference, frankly, because what's at stake here is the logic, whether you want to reduce certain behaviors to essentially commercial logic, or whether you want to have them regulated by incentives that are non-commercial logic. Again, I might be talking in the very abstract level here, but last year, one of the main proponents of gamification, a guy called Gabe Zicherman, wrote an op-ed where he argued that one way to boost civic participation in America is to start rewarding everyone who shows up and checks in with their phone at the voting place, on the election day, to reward them with some kind of virtual currency and turn it all into a game, right? I mean, that's an option that's now possible because we're all carrying mobile phones and we're all on Facebook and you have a virtual currency system. But that's essentially reducing or transforming an act that was previously done for a reason that had to do with politics. You showed up to vote because you care about your obligation as a citizen or you care about your obligation as a political subject, to something where you show up to vote because you learn points that you'll then add to other points you've earned by recycling, and you'll buy yourself a new latte. I mean, that's essentially what the logic is. And you might say that this is great because it will get people to show up at elections more. I just don't think that that's a good future for citizens, because the kind of problems we are facing, I think, will require more thinking from us and not less. And the problem with many of these gamification schemes is that they essentially seek to completely bypass the stage of deliberation, right? They don't bother, they don't care whether you develop any complex narratives about recycling as long as you do the right thing with your, gamified trash can. Right? You don't need to know why recycling is good or bad. You see, that's completely off the table now. They don't even want to develop any complex narrative in you. All that matters is that you understand the currency system under which your trash can functions. Right? I mean, that's what happens once you start introducing monetary incentives into things where, and I'm not saying that everyone who was recycling had this complex narratives about, climate change. Yeah. But I like the principle on which that approach was based. You might say that this is exactly what got us into the problem now, and I'll be happy to have the discussion. Yeah. But the basic argument I'm making is that a lot of these schemes, they might be great for efficiency, if by efficiency you mean getting things done, but they may not be good for citizenship because, again, they distract us from developing any complex narratives about the problems that will not be solved just by us adjusting our behavior. And I think that citizens by developing some of those narratives, might also then exercise their power differently when they show up on the election day or when they participate in civic life. I mean, all those acts of participation are stimulated by some thinking about the issue at hand. And I'm just not sure that that thinking will still be happening in a gamified world where everything is tracked and everything, has an incentive built into it.
Right, okay. And are you willing to entertain the idea that that some realms could be gamified without horrible harms, and in other realms we might want to preserve rich dialogue, engaged citizenry? I mean, the reason I ask is because this implicit in your argument was the idea that people, all sorts of wholesale goods come from when people internalize a particular viewpoint or they deliberate carefully about a set of things rather than simply doing the right behavior on question X. There's some meta attitude or behaviors that lead to X, Y, and Z.
Sure.
But there's public health research that suggests that getting people to adopt a healthy attitude and telling them to live healthfully has absolutely no effect on their behavior. We're very good at targeting specific behaviors. We're not so good at convincing people to adopt a mindset that has long-term payoffs along a number of other different areas.
Sure. Look, I mean, again, as I said at the beginning, what has changed in the last 10 or 15 years is that thanks to what has happened in Silicon Valley in the last decade, we have awoken in this new world where we do have the infrastructure for problem solving. This is where maybe I'm too utopian and futuristic, and maybe we wouldn't have any trash cans that have sensors in them, and all of this is just fantasy. But I do think that we have the access to this equipment, and now, next year, and in 5 years, when there is even less money on the table because the crisis gets even worse, or because everyone is even more excited about apps, we will have to start facing decisions as to how much stuff we want to gamify, because it might be the case that it will improve efficiency and it will improve participation rate in politics, even though no one will have any idea about what politics is anymore. And if that's the case, I want us to start tackling and political implications of this before we get to that stage. And people who are preaching gamification and points, by that logic, is accumulating frequent flyer miles is a game, and you're participating in gamification with every credit card use, right?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so just to turn the crank on this one more time, there are a number, maybe 4 questions on this exact topic. So can you say a little bit more about the extent to which you think that gamification or solutionism, the use of apps to solve complex social problems, is in fact a direct replacement or an inhibitor of more complex political and social, more ambitious attempts to solve deep problems?
Well, I mean, again, I can only speak from what I see happen in some countries. If you look at the UK, what happened in the UK 2 years ago, the government, very much influenced by Cass Sunstein and the whole rhetoric of nudging, set up behavioral economics unit in the government, and all they do is nudge people, and they may have saved a lot of money.
That's not all they do. I mean, they do arrest criminals. That's not a nudge.
The nudging unit. The behavioral economics unit. The nudging unit does just that. All they do is nudging. The thing is that if you read some of Cass Sunstein's papers that were published in November now and contain partly featuring his new book, Simple, there you can clearly see that he's very excited about this new problem-solving infrastructure, because now nudges can be personalized, right? Because now, if in the past you had to come up with nudges that were the same for everyone, I don't know how much you know about Cass Sunstein, but he has these great ideas. If you show up at a cafeteria, if you start showing vegetables before dessert, then more people will eat vegetables, right? So, but in the past, all those nudges were the same for everyone. We all were in the same cafeteria, and we all have more or less the same cognitive functions, so we all have the same nudges. But if you're wearing Google Glass and you show up at the cafeteria, you can actually have very different nudges built in for everyone, because everyone sees a different picture, because the picture is mediated by Google. Right? I'll give you a very scary example. Japanese researchers last year started and actually experimented with a pair of smart glasses, which are pretty much alike, the Google Glass, and they wanted to use those glasses to fight obesity. So what did they do? They actually started using them in a restaurant. And the way it works is that, you come to a restaurant and you order a steak and some fries and a Coke. And while you're wearing these fancy glasses, the glasses actually make your food look much bigger than it actually is, so that you start feeling fuller much sooner, right? Again, the fact that what we see now is heavily mediated, right, allows for new types of interventions, right? And that, I think, again, I can only tell you by following some of what people in the government are thinking, like what Cass Sunstein has been writing about, what has been happening in Britain. To me, those are the evidence cues, and to me, the inability of our policymakers to tackle problems differently and their excitement about Silicon Valley and apps, to me, those are some of the early proofs. Now, whether Silicon Valley should stop building apps is a different question. For me, the primary concern is that our policymakers, are no longer have a theory of how to distinguish between apps and non-apps. Right? My concern is primarily at the public and civic level, and not so much at the level of Silicon Valley. I can tell you that I'm very excited about Google thinking that it can fix the problems of Africa just by getting everyone connected, and that's what Google actually says. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think the World Bank can fix Africa, and I think Google probably has even less capability there. Yeah. But it's not the problem I'm trying to solve with this book. Right? For me, the primary intention is to alert policymakers as to what are some of the things that we might lose if we start relying on this infrastructure, and be dependent on it more and more.
Okay. So just one more, because one of the questions raised this point. I don't think Cass Sunstein or Google, to use the economics language, see those apps as substitutes. They see them as complements. And I think the premise is not, in a perfect world, how is the best way to solve all these complex problems? The first thing we should do is build an app. Mm-hmm. Actually, people see the world as horribly not satisfactory. And the political system is broken. And the economic system has all these failures. And here's a tool that actually might do something, could make a difference on the margin, and that's enough of a difference to do it.
Yeah, but if you really want to be to wear your economist hat full time, then you have to start talking about opportunity costs, right? But I wouldn't talk about opportunity costs. I would be talking about the fact that, we do exist in a certain political moment right now where many of these ambitious efforts are no longer viable. And, they crowd out, the fascination with apps crowds out efforts to do something more ambitious. And of course, Google wouldn't tell you that they're building it to, make sure that we bypass laws, or we bypass other ways of regulating. Why would I trust Google to say the truth here? And I'm sure that Cass Sunstein wouldn't tell it either, because his job is just to do the nudging. It's then up to the rest of the government to figure out how much other stuff they want to do. If you look at Britain, so let me give you an example from Britain. So in Britain, there is a think tank very close to the Conservative Party that recently published a white paper where they argue that basically, one way to cut on the healthcare expenditure is to start, they have their own national insurance scheme, so the way it works today is very different from the US. But one of the arguments was that if we can stop spending so much money on obese people who do not exercise, that would be great, because they're not taking any active steps to be healthy. So how would we know whether they actually take any steps? We'll be checking if they're using their smart cards to get into their gym. Right? Again, that's something that is very easily trackable, and as long as people get some kind of government, issued insurance, that's something that the government might claim we want to check, right? And there was a serious proposal written by a serious think tank close to the government. But you can have the same thing done with your cell phone. You can check whether these people are actually walking enough. And all of that information is gathered. And the temptation is do you want to do it or do you not want to do it? And in an environment where your deficits are expanding, that becomes suddenly a very tempting option.
Yeah. Can I ask you about that? So just because I think that might get to something, because I can think of a non-technology example where people are more willing to allow regulation. So I take it you think that's a really, really bad regulatory strategy. Do you also think it's a bad idea to ban cigarette smoking indoors?
No, I don't think it's a bad idea.
So in that case, people are making a life decision that affects their health, and there's a system cost. And the state says in response.
It's a semantic argument. I can tell you that indoor smoking also affects the health of other people. That's the primary argument against indoor smoking.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's how that battle has been won in the U.S.
Okay. Okay. So let me switch gears a little bit. I came today from Stanford, where I was working on in a cybersecurity panel, and it's funny. You're reading your book. You do catalog very effectively this sense in which there's this we can solve everything attitude, we can address every issue. In the cybersecurity realm, you see exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. There's this sense that it's all mayhem, we can't do defense, our networks are under attack. who has the better end of the story? I mean, their story is technology has left us completely vulnerable. And every one of them, I mean, even just looking at it as marketing, the story they're telling is we are under complete attack. We can't fix this problem. And you're saying, technologists are saying we can fix every problem.
But I mean, depending on which technologist has which technology, I mean, you'll have a very different story.
Well, so
why should I trust either of them, right? That's why I'm skeptical of one camp, and I'll be skeptical of the other. And I have been skeptical of people preaching cyber war for like 5 years now.
So what you're saying then, I mean, isn't it possible that in both cases someone is selling something? In both cases, there's advertising being done, and we can view it with skepticism or just dismiss it as advertising and not take it so seriously.
Yeah, I mean, if that was the case, I mean, the first premise of your question is absolutely correct. A lot of it is advertising, and some of those efforts are not genuine. And I mean, I can give you my own theory as to why Google and Facebook want to position themselves as being in the business of solving some of the world's greatest problems.
Right.
So my theory is as follows. One reason why they do it is because no one in Washington would want to tie the hands of our potential saviors. Right? If Google and Facebook can save the world or help us address obesity or help us address climate change, of course, you would not want to overregulate them. Right, so the temptation to treat them as any of the other bad guys, whether it's energy companies or someone else, would be much less. So there is an incentive for Silicon Valley to be seen as the equivalence of Human Rights Watch rather than the equivalence of ExxonMobil. All of that makes sense. There is another reason I think here at play, and that reason has to do with the fact that Silicon Valley competes for the same talent pool as Wall Street. And it's the same developers, engineers, mathematicians. And as long as Silicon Valley can pretend that they're solving all of the world's problems while Wall Street is creating all of those problems, they can actually hire more people, right? So to me, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why Silicon Valley does that. And, some companies do it more for advertising reasons. But, I mean, you can also deny the fact that these companies have also created the means. They run the platforms on which all those other apps are built. So Facebook exists, and then you can build an app that will be taking photos from your trash bin and posting them to, So, I mean, it's much more complex than just a bunch of companies, right? And all of them have very different priorities. But the problem is that many of them do believe their own advertising, and a lot of policymakers believe the advertising. A lot of policymakers just reach out to them because it coincides with their own agendas. Right. And I've seen it done at the State Department when we talk about Twitter and Facebook as the promoters and cheerleaders for democracy and freedom in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I see it now with a lot of these efforts to fix obesity or climate change.
So just to be clear, as I read the book, which I liked very much, I wrote in the margins, I think you spend too much time on Facebook. I mean, it's almost like you're taking
I'm not on Facebook.
Or Twitter, sorry. You're on Twitter quite actively. But if you're not taking their advertising claims seriously, their claims that they can solve all of the world's problems, which is obviously ridiculous. If anybody claims that, it's on its face ridiculous. How are you affected by it? How are you affected by it if you're not plugged in? If you choose to live offline? Does this argument bother? Should it bother someone?
Why are we even having this discussion? So what? Now the response to all of this is just to say we'll just be living offline now? I mean,
no. What I'm wondering is
I'll be having some kind of vintage trash cans which I could only buy before sensors.
No, my question is actually whether this argument is limited to the people who consume the technology that is being sold by people who are making the argument that they can solve everything.
If the British government will stop cutting my insurance because I carry a cell phone, I mean, I think it will affect quite a lot of people. Right? Again, it's an argument very often about semantics. You have to pick a certain project and see whether there are certain political, economic, and social conditions in place that will make it likely that a certain government agency or a certain government office, like the nudging office in Britain, will take it on. For many of those devices, I think the answer is yes. And for many of those devices, you'll actually see subsidies. I mean, I don't know how much time you spend dealing with people working for the European Commission. I can assure you, I could make a very nice PowerPoint and go and get a very nice grant from the European Commission to build a series of smart trash cans that will help the environment. I can just do a PowerPoint, get very nice EU funding, and then live comfortably for the rest of my life. The question then is whether people will be buying them. That's beyond the point. I'll have a subsidy. People might be buying it because I'll have the grant, I'll have venture funding, I can be doing a lot of things. So I think the situation is much more complicated here. You have to understand where the money comes from. You have to understand how those things are marketed. You have to understand some of the non-market forces at play. And I think some of those non-market forces may make those technologies spread much faster than they would otherwise. In part because we're dealing with important problems, right? You would want to underwrite the proliferation of some of such technologies because the assumption is that they do help us solve climate change or obesity or whatnot.
Right. Okay, so on a maybe hopefully more optimistic note, a couple of people have asked whether in the process of writing this book or maybe for a future book, have you encountered any hopeful uses of technology and maybe even technology in a way that nudges people? Or is it all bad?
I love microphones. No. Well, I mean, look, again, I have a very, I think, positive chapter, even in this book, the last chapter, where I'm trying to figure out how you can actually design technologies that will result in more complex narratives. It will result in users actually developing some insights into some of the broader socio-political systems that their devices represent. And I know it's a mouthful, but so I give an example of several interesting design efforts in Europe and in Germany and Scandinavia. So you have, just to give you one example, so you have a group of German designers who've built extension cords that basically look like a caterpillar. So once you plug devices into it and leave them there in standby mode, that extension cord that looks like a caterpillar starts twisting as if the caterpillar was in pain, right? And the assumption here is that in addition to the functionality that you get from a normal extension cord, we will also get some additional inducement, not necessarily to cut your energy costs, which would be nudging, but to actually think about something that you would not think about otherwise, right? In this case, it might be how the use of standby products is connected to the environment, to climate change, or to whatnot. But in this case, again, the assumption is not necessarily to make you think about something specific, but to make it look weird, right? To make you feel weird, and thus hope that you might develop some deeper insight into the current situation, right? So I give also an example. You can think also how this logic might apply to what's happening in your browser, for example, right? So now we think that one way to make people more aware of the privacy situation, right, of the sort of privacy cost to their browsing is to maybe have some kind of a pop-up that will emerge and tell them from their window, and it will tell them that now you're being tracked by 500 websites, right? But again, as such, this doesn't really tell you much. Right? It doesn't really tell you any information that you can reasonably process. What if it tells you that now you're being tracked by more websites that existed online in 1993? Right? Again, it also relies on some kind of a statement, but it's a very different statement that produces a very different feeling and might actually have you, go and search for something on Google and thus develop a greater insight into the problem of privacy or piracy. Right? So let me just give you one more example. So I've talked about fact-checking, right? And the idea with fact-checking is that you'll have all of those claims highlighted that might be true or false. There is another way to make people aware of the context, right? And there is another app, another extension, browser extension. It's called, it has a very bizarre name, Aggregator, and it stands for Military Academic Industrial Complex Aggregator. Right? And it's something that is very interesting. When you go to websites of universities, you should do that with Stanford. So when you go to websites of universities, right, this extension will suddenly insert random information about what defense projects these universities are engaged in. Right? When you look at the page for their trustees, board of trustees, it will tell you which defense projects the trustees are engaged in. Right? And the idea here is to randomly replace some of the text on the websites with information that the university is perhaps trying to hide. Right? And again, to do it in a way that is not necessarily pre-planned, and to do it in a way that is still weird and surprises you. Right? And that develops some very different type of understanding that they would get if you just were given a PDF file, right, to read every time you access that. Of course, this project veers much more towards art, and it is built by an artist. But to me, it's a very different type of intervention that relies on technology to produce a very different type of understanding and interaction with technology and with the world at large.
Interesting. So in that example, so bringing up, we were talking before about homophily and the idea that on the internet some people do get drawn into echo chambers, and there are attempts to solve this problem with technology, right?
Sure.
A problem created by technology that can be solved with technology. Does that mean, though, that the problem fundamentally is just a problem of not having the right code. We don't have in that case, in the book you rail against living by algorithm, but there it seems like there's homophily. Someone is fighting back against the homophily echo chamber on the internet by producing random information, but it's generated by algorithm, right?
In what example?
The example that you gave of the, I forget what you call it, migrator?
Yeah.
The information is being generated on the website, but it's not. Sure. It's not personal, right? It's being generated by an app.
Well, it's being generated based on a series of factoids that you have fed into the software. But again, I have no problem with algorithms. Yeah. It's not. A lot of people think that I have some kind of anti-technology outlook. I mean, I don't. Algorithms great, database is great, sensors great, phones are great, but very often the ways in which they are being used by our social and public institutions, and in which or not used by our social and public institutions, or not regulated by our social and public institutions, that bothers me. And I'm all for Google trying to play some kind of an algorithmic gatekeeping function in our world by, and they do, actually. It's not that they have a choice. I mean, they already do. They structure what we see. They structure the news we see. They structure the autocomplete suggestions we get in our search results. All of that is already happening. But I want Google to serve that function responsibly and not deny it. I mean, right now, if you listen to their defense, they would say that any autocomplete suggestions that we show you when you start typing something in Google, that's all generated objectively by other people searching for it, and we have no role to play here. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, and I'm not sure that saying that given that this system is gameable, given that you can go and manipulate it by paying 500 different people sitting in different parts of the globe to search for, my name and, evil, or my name is genius. And then everyone searching for my name will see genius, autocomplete my name. I mean, this is great, but you can also add all sorts of other, words which will not look so great when people search for my name. So that system is gameable. And the fact that Google is trying to claim that this thing exists objectively and they have no responsibility for policing it, to me, that's not a good move. I want Google to keep it, but I want them to do it responsibly and to face up to the responsibilities that they have rather than keep denying it. So let's use algorithms, but let's also govern them.
Okay, interesting. So one final question before we wrap up. As you're well aware, Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt released a book this week or last week.
April 26th.
April 26th. As you're very, very well aware. Can you say something about one of the questions suggested, just in this week in San Francisco, Jaron Lanier, Nicholas Carr, and you are giving talks on very similar subjects. Can you say something about the extent to which...
mine was unique?
Actually, it was all algorithm generated. Can you say something about the extent to which these are fellow travelers and the extent to which you think there is some... Sure. Intellectual development in the discussion of the use of technology to solve global problems. It's a subject that you railed on at the global level in the last book and continue to do so in this book.
Well, I mean, do I have an hour to answer it? No,
you have a minute.
On many issues, depending on sort of how far, like what kind of a macro view you want to take, you might say that me and Lanier and Carr, we all look at, for example, the role the technology companies play in shaping our discourse. So in that sense, we're very similar. But I mean, I have also a lot of methodological reflections on how we should think about the future of digital technology. I mean, there is one long part of the book we haven't even broached, and that's my attack on the very idea of the internet. And throughout the whole book, I actually put it in scare quotes, because I think at this point, the internet is invoked in a very promiscuous fashion, and it's being invoked to justify and make any position that you want to make. You can just say that this will break the internet, or this will not work on the internet, or this just goes against the grain of the internet. And I have no idea what that grain of the internet actually is. And a lot of technology companies have mastered that language really well. They know how to claim that something will destroy the internet if only that law passes or this law passes. And I just want us to start making better arguments, right? And I don't think that those arguments work. And so this reluctance to talk about the internet, I don't think it's present in Lanier, it's present in Carr. There are many other differences at the level of solutions. If you read Jaron Lanier's latest book, what he wants to do is to basically make sure that all of you get paid for using many of these websites. So, you go to Google and you search for something, and as a result, you improve Google's algorithm, so Google should pay you. It's to me, and first of all, that system relies on ubiquitous surveillance, and he's very open about it. He says, maybe we should stop worrying about privacy and then start paying people for companies using their data. I mean, that's not the stance I would endorse in my wildest nightmare. There are many other differences there, and so it's a very complex question. To what extent? I can tell you the thing about Eric Schmidt's book. I think it relies on, the existence of two worlds. One world is the real world, and one is the virtual world. And that entire book proceeds with them arguing that this virtual world have created new forms of power. So now that you have governments that can create and declare independence in virtual space. So they talk about virtual Chechnya that can go and declare virtual independence from Russia. And to me, that just makes no sense. Because Russia and Chechnya are fighting over a piece of physical land, and Chechnya can declare virtual independence tomorrow. It's not going to make a difference to any of the Chechens. It's like declaring that from tomorrow, you're finally free to breathe and wink. And what kind of meaningful achievement and freedom is that, right? It isn't. The very existence of that reality, the virtual reality in the virtual world, allows many of those claims to go unchallenged. And I think it's time to start challenging them. And, if you no longer believe that there is this separate virtual cyber reality out there, many of the arguments made by people debating the internet stop making any sense whatsoever, because they rely on the existence of a world that doesn't really exist. If tomorrow I posit the existence, I'm wrapping up. If tomorrow I posit the existence of a third world, right? And instead of the digital world, we call it digital squared, right? And then I go to proclaim that I've just set up a new search engine. And instead of Google, I call it Schmoogle. Right, so now we have a third world, right? We have digital squared in addition to digital, and we have a new search engine, right? Do you think I will get rich by proclaiming that I have a third world and I have a new search engine to index it? I wouldn't. Why? Because if you want to succeed, proclaiming that you have another reality and proclaiming that you have a search engine to index it is not enough. If I go and write a book that will be called The New Digital Age Squared, and then start convincing people that this age actually exists and this search engine is actually great, I might convince people to start using it. But it's not enough to just claim that, there is a new world out there and then there is a new actor out there and suddenly I have power just because I've created a new world. That just doesn't happen that way, right? Power, just like capital, doesn't care about how many worlds you posit, right? Positing new worlds with new power, with new institutions and new alternatives doesn't in itself change anything, right? Other than introduce mushiness into your own thinking about how the world works. Anyway, so watch out for my review of Eric Schmidt in 2 weeks in the New Republic. That's the shorter version.
Great. That concludes our program this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, join me in thanking Evgeny Morozov for his talk.
Thank you.